Hello, my name is John Nelson. I'm a member of the Riverview School Board, and I'm here to talk about the 2018-2019 school budget. Last year, you may remember, some of you may have seen the video that I put out on last year's budget, and people seem to like that format, so we'll try this again. Now, last year's budget was controversial, but not nearly as controversial as this year's budget. So I want to talk about the budget, but I also want to answer some questions that I keep hearing from the public in this video today. The first thing I'll say is that I think in sentiment, what I'm about to describe reflects the views of the people who voted in favor of this year's school budget. Certainly in style, in the way I approach the problem, in the way I provoke the answers, that's entirely my own. They may come at it slightly differently, but I think in sentiment it captures basically what I hear from people. Okay, so one of the things I've been trying to do, because this budget has been so controversial, is to engage with certain members of the public, basically with people who I think are level-headed people or smart people, and can help push my thinking that maybe there's something I'm missing, maybe I'm not seeing it right, and so I've met with several people. Thank you if you met with me to help elevate the way I think about this, and it's worked. I think I've learned quite a bit from that exercise, and I think other board members have done the same, and I think they have too. The first thing that I learned in those discussions is that there are fault lines in our community that are emerging. They may have always been here, but I was not as keenly aware of them as I've become. The first is Oakmont versus Verona. Essentially, at the core of this, when it comes to the schools, is the majority of the resources come from one town, and so there's perhaps from some a feeling that there's a kind of a cross subsidy that's not fair on some level. The parents versus non-parents is a big one. If you have kids in the schools and you benefit from what we do in the schools, that's great. But that cost is borne by you, and the cost is also borne by people who don't have kids in the school. Another fault line. New residents versus long-time residents. Now, this one probably doesn't make that much sense unless you bought a house in the community in the last 5 years. But I won't get into the dirty details of why there's such a differential. But suffice it to say that the amount of cost for the schools borne by new homeowners is very disproportionate to the amount of cost for the schools borne by long-time homeowners, and that creates another fault line. Young versus old. I've heard some nasty things particularly about the elderly in public meetings on social media. That's really just hard to wrap my head around. Homeowners versus renters, rich versus poor. But ultimately, I think all of these fault lines, all of these divisions, come down to the same basic underlying idea, and that is that there are some who benefit disproportionately from public education, or benefit more than others from the education that we provide, and there are others who bear the cost of that education disproportionately. And so that's what creates, I think, these fault lines for the most part, and that's one of the things that I've detected. So my plan today is pretty simple. I want to, a lot of people have been following this very closely, and you don't need this, but for the uninitiated, for the people who have been following at a distance, I just want to walk through what's going on with this year's budget very quickly, and then be very direct about what I see here, and about why we voted the way we did, why I voted the way I did. A lot of you have been asking, can you lay out your reasoning carefully for us? And that's what I intend to do. And then talk about where that leaves us. Okay, so very simply, budgeting for schools is not different than budgeting for a business or budgeting even in your home. Basically, what we're trying to do is balance the amount of money coming into the district with the amount of money going out, the amount of money being spent. Okay, and if you saw last year's video, you might remember that we did that, and we did it at a level of $22.3 million. Okay. And the way that we did that is on the revenue side. Last year, we against my constitution, I voted for, and we voted for, to raise taxes to the maximum allowed under the state law, and I think at the time I even encouraged people who otherwise probably would not be inclined to do that to do so, and we did it. And then we mined our delinquent taxes. We had a pool of delinquent taxes that had not been collected, and we went really hard after those, and were able to collect quite a bit, which helped out. And then on the expenditure side, we did a few things. We made some aggressive assumptions in the budget about expenses, about how we could hold expenses down. So aggressive that it's frankly a little uncomfortable right now. We're getting down towards the end of the year and not sure we're going to quite be able to make our budget assumptions on the cost side. But we made some aggressive assumptions to help balance. We did some cuts last year, but they were non-personnel cuts. Okay, you look first for things that you can do that don't affect employees, that don't affect the people that we work with. So we did that last year, and that was a piece of it. And finally, we transferred some money last year, about $70,000 out of our fund balance. And what does that mean? What that means is essentially the analogy would be in your home if you took money out of your savings account to pay for your cable bill. So we did that. We had to do that to close the gap last year. That is not a good situation. That's not generally what you want to do. But we did it last year to close that gap. Okay, so moving forward to this year's budget, same idea. We need to balance the amount coming in with the amount going out. And this year, the amount of the total budget is $23.1 million. So the first thing you might notice is that revenue, without a tax increase, that revenue increased by $800,000 in this year's budget. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The problem is, though, on the cost side, that our costs when we rolled up initially had increased $1.6 million. Okay, and then we had to cut $800K to get back to the level of taxes, the level of revenues that we were expecting in the year. So that's why we are where we are at a high level. So you might ask, well, where did the increase of revenues come from? And it came from a few places. It came from a little less than $200K. Came from new properties coming online. These are properties down on the river that came onto our tax rolls. There's the second area is there's an insidious little tax that if you bought a house in the last 5 years, I don't need to describe to you, that I disaffectionately call the welcome neighbor tax, and we collected another about $200K through that mechanism. And then finally, some increased subsidies related to some specific things, mostly special ed, from the state and the federal government. And that's where the $800K increase in revenues came from. On the expenditure side, it was sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. Everything went up, or a lot of things went up, and they all went up at once. Salaries rose, benefits rose. Those are contractual costs that went up. Special ed and the transportation associated with special ed, the transportation associated with getting kids who need special ed outplacement to the places they need to get the care and get the education that they require went up, and that's about $400K of the increase. Their legal fees went up about $200,000, and there's been a lot of discussion about legal fees in the public. I want to clear this up as much as I can, because some of the legal fees, some of the legal matters rather, are things that we can't openly talk about as much as I'd like to. But the legal fees going up about $200K had to do with a couple of things. It had to do with the fact that we issued a bond and we needed some special legal counsel around that. But more of it had to do with the fact that the teacher's contract is expiring in June, and we're negotiating that, and we'll continue to negotiate that with the teachers union, and that number represents the legal support for that endeavor. And then a few other things: debt service I mentioned, charter tuitions, and textbooks. But they all rolled together to create this situation where our costs were up $1.6 million from last year, and then we had to find it somewhere else. But to make this, I think, as simple as I can, maybe, this year's budget, $23.1 million. On the revenue side, there is no property tax increase. Okay, so there's no revenue increase in addition to the $800K I just described. And on the cost side, the way that we achieved the $800K that we were looking for, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, is that we had to make some cuts. And I think specifically what's causing the consternation and the debate in the public has to do with these two items: to tax or not to tax, and to cut or not to cut. And those are valid things to ask. But that's in the most simplistic terms what this is all about. So this is the budget that passed, and let's take a look at how that happened. And what I want to pull up here is a chart of the people who voted in favor and people who voted against. And someone remarked to me, and I think they're right, that this is a really interesting. These are two really interesting groups of people. They're not people who you would necessarily expect to be voting, in the same way. Most school board votes are 9-0. They're not controversial, but if you'd expect a vote to split, you might not expect it along these lines. And I think that's fair. And so I started to look at the two groups. I want to talk in particular, though, about the group at the top, the group who voted in favor of the budget that I just showed you a minute ago. And so, I kind of looked at this and I looked for, all right, what are the patterns here? What are alike about these people? So, men and women, 3 men, 3 women, range of ages from early 30s through retirement age. Nothing really defining kind of on its face. I looked at each person's political affiliation in the group. And again, completely bipartisan majority. Completely bipartisan majority. 3 registered Republicans, 3 registered Democrats. Nothing really to see there. Very interesting. And then I looked at, who has kids in the district in these groups. Now, most people on the board do not have kids in the district. I do. And then it's a mix also in the people who voted against it. So nothing in particular I don't think to see there. And then I looked at where does everyone live. And so you do see a bit of a fault line here in that everyone who voted in favor of the budget is from Oakmont, and not everyone who voted against it is from Verona, but you could see how they break out. Not a whole lot to learn, frankly, there. I think it just feels like a mixture, and like there's not a real pattern to it. The last thing I thought to look at is if you thought about school taxes as the amount to which someone has skin in this game, maybe, I thought to look at what does each person on the board pay in taxes, and can we learn about how they voted from what's going on with them. And I'm not going to put those numbers up, but I will tell you those are publicly available, and you can go find them yourselves. I don't want to embarrass my colleagues, but let me just tell you in summary, what I found there was no real pattern. I found that most people cluster in right around the same amount of school taxes. There is one outlier on the high side, and there are a couple of outliers on the low side. But in general, most of the group are kind of packed around the same number. There wasn't much to learn as far as I could tell from that analysis. So what's going on here? So there's nothing obvious. There's nothing demographic. There doesn't seem to be anything ideological. Maybe there's something more to this story. And I mentioned before that people wanted us and wanted me to lay out the reasons why I voted the way I did, and so I think I'd like to get into that. So before I do that, very quickly, you might recall if you saw last year's video, I was concerned about some things. One is the decay over time of our performance of our students in school. Number 2 was that at the time it was costing us $22,000 per kid roughly to educate each and every child in the district. Nothing's changed there except the meter has continued to run. Now it's $23,000. And also that there's this disproportionality that out of every, it turns out that about 20% of the households in the district have a kid or kids in the schools, and 80% do not. So there's this disproportionality about who bears the cost and who benefits directly from the funding. And then finally, you might remember my friend Eleanor. Eleanor is a composite sketch meant to represent a vulnerable population, a voiceless population in the district, and she is very concerned. She's on fixed income and is very concerned about her taxes going up, and I understand. I understand that. So here's the question that I get over and over and over and over and over. Why not just increase taxes? And I want to lay out for you why I think that is not the right way to go, but even if you think it is, that you shouldn't come to that decision lightly. And so basically it comes down to 3 factors. There are 3 factors converging all at once that make this not a slam dunk. And the first is Eleanor. But the question you might ask is Eleanor even real? Is she a figment of your imagination, or is she actually real? And so we looked at that. Last year, you might recall that I wanted to commission a study from an outside firm on tax capacity, on demographics, and some other things. We were not, unfortunately, able to find a firm that could do it the way we wanted, but we started to study pieces of this ourselves. And here is what emerged. So, is Eleanor real? In other words, how old is our school district? Do we really have this aging population? Okay. So what this chart shows you is the top line is the median age in Pennsylvania, in our county, and in our school district compared to the U.S. And what this tells you is we live in a state that's much older than the rest of the United States. We live in a county that's older than the state on average, and our school district has a very old population compared to the rest of the United States and compared to the rest of the state even. So that's part of what we have to remember, and part of what we have to consider when we think about tax increases. And then also you can look at it on a percent basis, but what percent of our population is above 65%. And again, you can see that is much larger than in those other entities. So that's the reality. This is U.S. Census data. You can pull it yourself. But that's the reality of the population that we're looking at. And the question that I get when I say these kinds of things or present this kind of data is typically something along the lines of this. When I'm at the park or at Berkey's or at the pub with my friends, I don't feel Eleanor. I don't see Eleanor. I don't think that's what this is. I see a lot of young families moving in that I don't recognize, so I think that's what's going on here. And so it doesn't feel that way. And I get that. I agree that if you're in those places, if you're a young professional parent and you're hanging out with your friends, that Eleanor is not immediately visible to you. And I want to show another population that's not immediately visible to you as well. This analysis along the same lines is how wealthy the school district is. Okay, so again, if you're a young professional, it might come as a shock to you that half of the reported incomes in our school district are less than $35,000 a year. Okay, the point is we have these vulnerable populations, and you can't just raise taxes on them and not account for the fact that this is going to really be a hardship on some people. And just because you don't feel it doesn't mean it isn't real. So I guess ultimately I assure you Eleanor is very real. The second thing that I remember that I mentioned that there are three factors coming together. The second factor is this. This is a chart of our enrollment, our student enrollment in our school over time. I think it dates back about 20 years. And what you see here is pretty dramatic. It's a pretty precipitous decay in the number of students, about 40% I think over time in the number of students attending our school district. And what's interesting is that if you superimpose the infrastructure on that, the number of employees and the number of buildings on this graph, they really haven't fallen off. So I add these two bars are the number of teachers in 1996 and the number of teachers now in 2018 that we have, and you can see they're not much different. In fact, it's even up a little bit. And if I did buildings, they would be the same as well. So the point is, we're having this precipitous drop in enrollment, but we don't get a corresponding drop in our infrastructure, and that creates a lot of stress. And that leads to, when I say $23,000, this is the kind of thing that leads to that phenomenon. And so that is not so when you look at that, that does not scream at me, let's just throw more money at it. That screams at me something very differently. That screams at me that this is a trend that we need to arrest. And the third reason why I don't think it makes sense to raise taxes is I was having a drink the other night with a friend of mine, and this guy is a very bright guy, the kind of guy where if he doesn't agree, I pay very close attention because he sees things clearly. It's not the kind of guy who throws a temper tantrum because he's not getting the thing he wants. But he asked me a really important question that opened my eyes to something. He asked me a question about, isn't this an investment in our kids? And I love the framing of this problem as an investment in kids. It's absolutely the right way to think about public education, an investment in kids. And I didn't have this data at the time, but I grabbed a napkin and I drew for him a picture on a napkin to try to illustrate the point that I'm about to make. Since then, I've actually done the graph and pulled the data, and I'll show it to you here in a minute. So this graph is a graph that shows, essentially it shows the trade-off between cost and quality in public education. On the vertical axis is something called the School Performance Profile, the SPP score. And this is a score that the State Department of Education puts out basically to rate how schools are doing. And no measure is perfect, of course, but I like this one because it measures outcomes on standardized tests, and it also combines into it growth measures. Are our kids getting better from the beginning of the year to the end of the year? So the SPP score is on the vertical axis. And then on the horizontal axis is cost per student. And cost per student is a good measure because it helps us measure districts against each other. Okay? Because districts are of different sizes, and so it's hard to compare unless you look at what they do per student. Okay, and then on this picture, I'll drop in this diagonal line across it, which is meant to depict kind of a straight line trade-off between cost and quality. If you're on the line, essentially, you're getting the quality that you should be getting at that cost. So the goal would be you want to be on that line or above it. You don't want to be below it. Okay? The best thing you can possibly be is high into the left, right? You're getting really good quality at a really low cost. And the place you don't want to be is kind of low and to the right. You're expensive, and you're not getting the outcomes that you'd like for that expense. Okay? So I'm going to drop in some data on this chart. I'm going to drop in Riverview, but then I'm also going to drop in the schools that touch Riverview, and then all the schools that touch the schools that touch Riverview. Picture sort of two circles emanating out from Riverview, and we'll take a look at what we find. So again, this shows the trade-off between cost and performance in each of these school districts. Okay, and so maybe one example to look at is Fox Chapel in the upper right. They perform really well, but they also cost a lot. Hampton, on the other hand, performs quite well and does it at a lower cost, and so on and so forth. And you can see where Riverview is on this chart. Not where we want to be. One way to think about where we sit is that the vertical distance between where we are and this orange line is essentially the performance gap. It's at this price, here's where we'd expect to be from a performance standpoint. Or you could look at it the other way. You could look at the distance between where we are and this orange line on the horizontal is our cost gap. Basically, if you say we are what we are, our performance is fixed at some level, fine, but that says that you should be able to get that performance at a much lower cost. So we're in this zone where you really don't want to be, I don't think. And so for some people, I know charts sort of make you go cross-eyed. You don't like charts as much. Let me show this slightly differently. Another way to look at this is just a list. Okay, and this is a list of the most expensive schools in the county ranked by cost per student. And what you can see here is that where Riverview ranks is 7th most expensive in the county on a cost per student basis. Okay, and that's fine on its own. That doesn't mean a whole lot. It's kind of an odd group of schools to be grouped with, I think. Not generally schools we would consider peers, but we're 7th. If we put next to that performance to try to compare it, we are not 7th on performance. In fact, we don't even make the top 20. We're 24th. So we're 7th most expensive in the county, yet we're the 24th highest performing in the county. Okay, that's a gap. That's a gap, and I'm not sure that that's the status quo that you want to cement. And this is not a story that says to me we should be throwing a whole lot more money at the problem. This begs for something a little different than that. Okay. But here's a question that I get a lot. I heard our SAT scores are really good. So maybe the SPP score doesn't show it, but maybe the SAT scores do. Okay, and so what people mean when they say that is that the State Department of Education released SAT scores by district, and in our area, Riverview did, at least on the face of it, fairly well. We ranked second in our area after Fox Chapel in average and mean SAT scores. Okay, and so let's zero in on that. So that's not bad. I'd rather be second than something less than second, certainly. But let's zero in on that a little bit, and I'll zero in just on the top two here. A couple of things you might notice. The first thing that you might notice is that there is a chasm as wide as the Allegheny River between 1 and 2, both in ranking and in mean score. But even that doesn't really mean much until you see how it translates into outcomes for kids. Why does this even matter? Who cares, right? And so we looked at this, we studied this, and what we found was that in Fox Chapel, with a score like that, their students start to become competitive. Their average student, okay? Remember, the average score starts to become competitive at schools like these, okay? For Riverview, our students are highly competitive at schools like these. And I'm not picking on these schools, okay? My wife went to one of the teachers' colleges. My father went to Temple University. I'm not picking on those places. It's fine. Those are good places. But there's a difference here. And these are just the averages. So remember, there are kids that will be above this and kids that will be below it. But if your average kid is able to be competitive at places like this, just imagine what your top performers can do. And if your average kid is competitive at a place like this, just imagine how far your top performer has to go to get to a really elite university. Okay, so this is about raising our ceiling. Okay, so this is not a bad story. SATs are not a bad story here. The question is, though, does it meet our aspiration? So is this an investment in our kids? Is that what we have here? And I guess there are two divergent and valid philosophies here. One is that we should keep the status quo. And this is sort of the we're special beyond measure philosophy. But I don't know where that leads. I don't know where that leads. I guess implicit in that is that there's a steady diet of ever-increasing taxes. We're moving ever further to the right, becoming ever more expensive. And eventually, I don't know, it just becomes so expensive that no one in their right mind thinks that's okay. And of course, not changing anything academically doesn't lead to any improved performance, and so we aren't doing things that could arrest the population decline either. So I'm not sure where that philosophy leaves us. But there's a second philosophy, and that is that this is not good enough. Okay? And that's a tough pill to swallow, I know. That's a tough pill to swallow. Because what that requires is refocus. It requires an unrelenting attention to academics first, and it requires us to be intrepid to change. So those are the two philosophies, and I guess you just have to choose one or the other, and I've chosen the latter. In summary, there are 3 reasons why I believe that it is not appropriate to raise taxes, given what we're looking at. The first is that our enrollment has declined dramatically and our infrastructure has not caught up with it. The second is that the dollars we're getting today are not translating into the academic outcomes that they're supposed to. And the third is that we have a vulnerable population out there that we expect to finance this educational enterprise, and you have to remember them because they're voiceless, and you have to remember them when you make these decisions. So some of you may buy off on what I've said up to this point, but you want to look at specific cuts, and you want me to talk about specific cuts. I'll bite. I'll talk about a few of these. The first thing I hear is about office staff, and it's an entirely reasonable thing to ask. So we insisted that the superintendent and her team do that, and here's what we found. What we found was that we are pretty lean and mean compared to everyone else. What we also found is that there are certain jobs that don't go away just because your population is declining, unfortunately. This is one of the key challenges of having a lack of scale. You know, payroll and mandatory reporting to the state and other jobs that it just takes to run the enterprise don't go away just because you have fewer students. So we could cut heads, certainly, from the administrative staff, and what would happen is those tasks remain, and the overtime for the remaining people would just rise. So that's what we found there, and I think that satisfied me. When I saw that, that helped me get my head around what is the appropriate level of staffing. Otherwise, I wouldn't know. I think it's unfortunate that we have to cut anyone. I think it's really unfortunate that we have to cut people who deal with kids on the front line. But I don't think there's anything there to find. At least I'm convinced of this analysis, and so I don't have a whole lot more to say on that one. The other one, probably the biggest question that we get is this. And my answer to that one is humble. My answer to that is, frankly, I don't know the answer to it. I am not trained to determine the optimum level of music versus language arts versus mathematics that a kid should have when they're getting a high quality education. I don't know. And none of the other board members are trained in that either. And I'm guessing that not very many, if any, people in the public are trained to do that. But I'm certainly not, and you don't want me making that decision. But what we do is we hire people who are trained to do that, and then we put a lot of pressure on them recently about academic performance to fix it. That this is not good enough. That what we're accomplishing here is not good enough. And the answer that came back is that we need a little bit of refocus. And this is an area where we're not cutting programs. If we were cutting programs, then I might intervene at that point and say, wait a minute, isn't that attached to better academics? But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that we're getting a little skinnier on a couple of things that are popular. But what no one has asked me, not one person has asked me is, and this is the question that I asked of the superintendent when I first heard about these cuts myself, what will my kids be doing when they're not in these specials? What will my kids be doing when they're not there? You know what the answer was? The answer was more academics. And I thought to myself, yeah, I can live with that. So a vision that I have for the future is not specifically about the arts or specifically about any program, but rather it's this. It's a high quality education at a reasonable cost. And I'll add the proviso here for the long term. I think that's the durable model. I think that's where we need to focus. That's what inspires me. I'm happy to talk about that with you all day long because I think that's where we need to be. I'll conclude with this, a warm, hearty congratulations to the 66 of you students who are graduating from Riverview in June. I wish you the very best of luck in life and hope that you're inspired to follow your dreams. And to the rest of you, I thank you for listening. I hope that this cleared up some of my reasoning, some of the other board members' reasoning in voting the way that we did. So thanks again for listening.